NASCAR might be a professional sport, but like any sport, entertainment is where they make their money. And over its more than 75-year-long history, some drivers have forced NASCAR to change the rules for the sake of entertainment. Perhaps the greatest example that most NASCAR fans are already aware of is Matt Kenseth. Matt Kenseth was undoubtedly a fantastic race car driver, but unfortunately for most fans in the stands, sorry Eric, he wasn't always the most exciting. Well, at least until he pilot drove Joey Logano into the wall at Martinsville, that certainly got him some fans. And in 2003, the last year of the Winston Cup, Matt Kenseth pushed the old system to its breaking point, winning only a singular race on March 2nd at Las Vegas, and then maintained his points lead all the way to the end of the season with an impressive 25 top 10s. It was quite literally NASCAR's version of watching an NFL team field goal their opponents to death. It was the death of 1,000 paper cuts. And so when Brian France rolled out the chase for the Nextdale Cup the next season, for many years it was not so affectionately referred to as the Matt Kenseth rule. Which, honestly, attributing our entire playoff system to one driver seems like a bit of an unfair narrative. Because if you ask me, the driver who had much more to do with this point system overhaul is actually the guy who finished 6th in the standings that year, Ryan Newman. With 8 wins in the season, Newman had visited victory lane twice as much as any other driver that year. The problem was, Newman was horribly inconsistent, except when it came to winning the pole every dang weekend, as he finished in the garage 7 times that season. Pretty much he was having a Kyle Larson season before it was cool. And so NASCAR introduced a new system that emphasized winning more than it had in the past. Except, it really didn't, when you think about it. To this day, I still have no idea why they didn't just round the winner's points up to 200. That would have been a nice way to emphasize winning. I mean, you could still get a top 5 in every single chase race and win the championship, so... Though what's funnier is that this isn't the only rule change that Ryan Newman played a role in. Remember those poles I mentioned earlier? Well, his nickname wasn't Rocket Man for nothing, as Newman won a staggering 26 poles in his first 3 full-time seasons. This forced NASCAR to implement a rule restricting what gears a team could use, because Penske was able to turn way more RPM than the rest of the competition. But before any of this took place, drivers had been influencing the rules for years. Richard Petty, the king himself, was ironically responsible for NASCAR introducing the Past Champions Provisional rule in 1991. This was because in the previous 2 seasons, Petty had failed to qualify for numerous races, leading to a drop in ratings. The old school version of the Chase Elliott effect, if you will. But while this may have started as the Richard Petty rule, it quickly devolved into the Darrell Waltrip rule. We've discussed the ending of Darrell Waltrip's career many times in this channel and how it was downright absolutely terrible. And during that span, no driver abused the Champions Provisional like old DW. The system worked relatively fine up until 1998, where Darrell Waltrip had to use the provisional to qualify for 20 out of 33 races that year. And starting in 1999, NASCAR had to limit provisional uses to 8 per season, causing Waltrip to miss 7 races that year after he burned up all of his provisionals. Ironically, Richard Petty only used the provisional 3 times in his last 2 seasons, while Darrell used it a whopping 39 times. After DW's retirement in 2000, other teams quickly began figuring out that you could just hire a washed-up champion to make the race and help get your car into the top 35 in points, and then you could hire the driver that you actually wanted to hire to run the rest of the races. And this is basically what guys like Bill Elliott and Terry Labonte turned into for most of the 2000s. And after that, NASCAR limited the provisional even further, pretty much spelling doom for the end of Dale Jarrett's career, as he moved to MWR, a team with no owner points, and most weekends he wasn't able to fall back on the provisional, leading him to miss 12 races in 2007. He would use the provisional for all of his allotted times in 2008, before retiring for good and passing the ride to David Rudiman. And wouldn't you know it, Team Penske even found a way to use this rule to their advantage just before it was abolished for good. As in 2007, Penske would transfer Kurt Busch's points to the 77 car at season's end, so that rookie driver Sam Hornish Jr. could make the 2008 Daytona 500, while Kurt could fall back on the Champions Provisional if he had to. And as fate would have it, Kurt would blow a motor in the duels, and ultimately did have to use the Provisional, while Sam got into the race using Kurt's points. A huge brain move that NASCAR did not look at as favorably. Speaking of Dale Jarrett, he was largely responsible for the abolishment of the racing back to the line rule in 2003, as several drivers racing for the lead at New Hampshire barely dodged Jarrett, who was stranded in the middle of the racetrack. The broadcast also pointed out how Jarrett had already removed his steering wheel and belt buckles, leaving him in an incredibly vulnerable and dangerous state. Prior to the race, NASCAR had reportedly already told drivers to let the leader pace the field back to the yellow as a gentleman's rule, but obviously that wasn't what ended up happening. And so, as of 2004, racing back to the yellow was officially dead, and now the field is frozen at the moment of caution. Yet another rule that came out of the early 2000s was the passing under the yellow line rule at superspeedways. Many believe that this rule came directly as a result of Dale Earnhardt's passing in the 2001 Daytona 500. And so many years removed, it's easy to see why that accident gets conflated with this rule change. Because the rule was put into effect at the very next superspeedway race at Talladega that spring. But it wasn't because of Earnhardt. Rather, Jimmy Spencer spent nearly an entire day protesting NASCAR to add the rule after Mike McLaughlin blocked him across the entire track during the Busch Series race that weekend. Oh, the irony that Mr. Excitement would create the rule that has probably killed most of our excitement. The rule was immediately controversial, as Tony Stewart would be the first driver called for it in the closing laps of the race, but Stewart refused to serve his penalty and still retained his second place finish. How ironic that Tony Stewart forcing Regan Smith below the yellow line at the same racetrack 7 years later would lead NASCAR to create the double yellow line rule for twice the ambiguity. This finish also forced NASCAR to rewrite the yellow line rule, stating that the driver who forced another driver below the yellow line would be penalized, not the driver who made the pass. Ironically, this was exactly what Stewart did to Regan Smith and faced no repercussions for it once again. Untrusting of NASCAR's new rule, this would directly lead to Brad Keselowski standing his ground and sending Carl Edwards into the stands for an impromptu meet and greet to the very next Talladega race. That's the thing about NASCAR drivers, even if they're not the ones getting screwed by NASCAR, they will remember. But if you're mad at Tony for getting away with 2 instances of bad calls, you'll be happy to know that he was the victim of one of NASCAR's most ridiculous decisions in 2016. After Tony Stewart missed the beginning of the season with his back injury and started observing the races from the pit box, he criticized NASCAR for allowing teams to get away with only putting 2 lug nuts on tires at the end of the race, leading to serious safety concerns. NASCAR was angered by Stewart questioning their authority, so they fined him $35,000 and then immediately created a rule where you could be fined or even disqualified for leaving too many loose lug nuts. So basically they told Tony Stewart, hey, thanks for your help, but never speak your mind ever again. Are we shocked that he decided to leave NASCAR at the end of last year? Another more recent rule change sparked by a driver was Kyle Busch and other Cup drivers absolutely stinking up the lower series. But yeah, mostly Kyle Busch. At first in 2011, it was announced that Cup drivers could no longer run for Xfinity or Truck Series points, after the past 5 championships have been won by full-time Cup Series drivers, including Brad Keselowski, Kyle Busch, Clint Bowyer, Carl Edwards, and Kevin Harvick. In 2017, Cup drivers were limited to only 10 starts per year in the lower series, after Kyle Busch put up a 4th double-digit win season in Xfinity, and that number was lowered again to 5 in 2020. So while a lot of Cup drivers may have cumulatively been responsible for this rule change, Kyle Busch definitely seems to be the main culprit as the winningest driver across both trucks and Xfinity. Though not as strongly correlated as some of these other rule changes, it's widely believed that Jamie McMurray played a role in NASCAR creating the win-and-you're-in playoff system that we have today, as everyone was so appalled that he could win the sport's 2 biggest races and not make the chase. Maybe he should have just been more consistent? Did that ever cross anybody's mind? Of course, speaking of said playoff system, if the original chase was the Matt Kenseth rule, this current one was certainly the Jimmy Johnson rule, as it came out of seemingly nowhere after Jimmy won his 6th championship, ironically over Matt Kenseth in 2013. The system seems to be purposely made to be as random and difficult as possible to prevent somebody from ever going on a Jimmy Johnson-like chase run ever again. Something that appears to have worked relatively well up until, well, Team Penske figured out how to break the system again. Another odd, well, I was going to say coincidence, but probably not a coincidence, was the damaged vehicle policy being introduced in 2016, right after Matt Kenseth junked Joey Logano. NASCAR has always claimed that the DVP was introduced to prevent cars from returning to the racetrack and create unsafe conditions with debris flying off the cars. But let's be honest, when has NASCAR ever passed on an opportunity for a good old late race debris caution? Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure Matt Kenseth returning to the track 100 laps down to take out the championship leader is probably what inspired this rule. And how fitting is it that the DVP is basically getting scrapped in the same year that we return to Bowman Gray Stadium? Seems like we might be in for a show. And well, with Matt Kenseth, it seems like we've come full circle. I'm sure there are tons of other examples, like Bobby Allison's crash led to the creation of restrictor plates, Kevin Harvick wrecking the field at Talladega led to the overtime line. There's probably endless other examples that you could look at, so be sure to leave them in the comment section down below if I didn't mention it here. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and check out dailydownforce.com for more awesome NASCAR content.